My name is Delaney Marsh, and 6 months ago, I was lying on the floor of my own kitchen with a broken wrist, my phone screen shattered 3 feet away, and my stepfather's voice in my ear telling me that no one would ever believe me. He was wrong. But before I tell you how I know that, let me start from the beginning. Because it didn't happen all at once. It never does. Growing up in Knoxville, Tennessee, my world was small and sweet in the way that only childhood worlds can be. We lived in a yellow house on Sycamore Lane with a porch swing my dad had painted white 3 times over because he could never get the color quite right. He was like that, meticulous, patient, a man who believed anything worth doing was worth doing until it was exactly right. He taught high school chemistry and coached the junior varsity baseball team on weekends, and he smelled like coffee and Old Spice and everything I thought was permanent. He used to say, "Delaney, the only thing you owe this world is your best effort and an honest heart." I believed him completely. I had no reason not to. My mother was the kind of woman who filled a room without trying. Warm, funny, a little scattered, always burning something on the stove and laughing about it. She ran a small alterations shop out of our garage, and the sound of her sewing machine was the soundtrack of my childhood. Saturday mornings, she'd let me pick fabrics from her scrap bin, and we'd sit together on the floor making ridiculous little quilts for my stuffed animals. Those mornings felt eternal. They weren't. I was 16 when my father had the stroke. He was at the school, standing at the whiteboard mid-sentence, and then he wasn't. He survived, but not fully, not the way he'd been before. He spent 8 months in rehabilitation and came home to a hospital bed in our living room, and the man who returned was quieter, slower, a soft echo of himself. He died 14 months later on a Wednesday afternoon while I was at school taking a biology exam. My mother called me out of class to tell me, and I remember thinking that was wrong somehow, that I should have known, that I should have felt it happen. The year after was the year my mother learned how to disappear while still being present. She moved through the house like a soap for herself, cooking, cleaning, answering questions, but absent behind the eyes. The shop in the garage went quiet. The sewing machine gathered dust. She started sleeping too much, then not at all. I watched her shrink, and I didn't know how to stop it. At 17, I was buying groceries with the debit card she'd leave on the counter, paying the electric bill online because she'd forget, checking on her in the night the way parents check on children. Dennis Cahill came into our lives the summer before I left for college. He was a contractor, of course he was, who'd been hired to replace the rotted deck boards at the back of our house. He was in his mid-40s, tall, with a tan that came from working outdoors, and a manner that read, at first, as straightforward and dependable. He brought my mother coffee the second morning he was there. She laughed at something he said. A real laugh, full and surprised. I can still hear it. I stood at the kitchen window watching them and felt something I couldn't name yet. Something between relief and dread, like the first seconds after you hear thunder before you know how close the storm is. He fixed the deck. He came back to fix the gutters. Then the hot water heater. My mother started wearing lipstick again. I told myself that was a good thing. They were married 11 months later, 2 weeks after my 18th birthday. I was at the ceremony, standing beside my mother in a blue dress she'd altered herself. And I told myself that the way Dennis looked at me across the reception table, assessing, proprietary, was just nerves, just discomfort, just me projecting grief onto a regular person. The first time he came into my room without knocking, I was a month from leaving for the University of Georgia on a partial journalism scholarship. He stood in the doorway, his shoulder filling it, and looked at the boxes I'd been packing. "You know you should be helping your mother instead of running off," he said. Not loud, not angry, just flat like a fact. "She depends on you. You leaving is going to set her back." "I'm going to school," I said. "She wants me to go." He smiled at that, a slow, patient smile that had nothing kind in it. "She says what you want to hear, sweetheart. That's what she does." He looked around my room one more time and left without closing the door behind him. That night, my mother came in to help me fold clothes, and I started to tell her what he'd said. She listened, and for a moment something moved behind her eyes. Recognition, maybe. But then she smoothed the shirt against her arm and said, "He's just worried about me, baby. He means well." And I looked at her and understood at 17 that she had already begun the long work of translation, turning his cruelty into something she could survive. I went to school. I studied. I built a life that was mine in a way nothing before it had ever been. I had a roommate named Becca who became my closest friend, a journalism professor who told me I wrote with clarity and nerve, a part-time job at the campus paper that I loved with an uncomplicated joy. I called home every Sunday. The calls were always short. My mother's voice always had that careful quality, like she was measuring each word before she released it. Dennis was always in the background. "Who is it?" sometimes. "Tell her we're about to eat." The invisible hand on the dial. The Christmas of my sophomore year, I came home and noticed that the family photographs in the hallway had been rearranged. My father's face was gone from the frames. His wedding photo, his picture with me at my 8th grade graduation, the one of him holding me at the hospital the day I was born. In their place were images of Dennis at a fishing tournament, Dennis and my mother at a casino in Gatlinburg, Dennis grinning in front of a new truck. He had replaced my father on the wall of our own home, and my mother, when I pointed to the empty nail where my favorite photo had hung, just said quietly, "He thought it might help us move forward." I put my bag down and went to find Dennis in the living room. "Where are my father's photos?" I asked. He looked up from the television with an expression of bored patience. "Boxed up in the garage. You can take them with you when you leave. They belong on the wall." "Not anymore," he said, and looked back at the screen. That was the Christmas I understood what he was doing. Not all at once. I'd understood pieces of it for years. But that night, sitting on my childhood bed in a room that felt like a stranger's, I understood the full shape of it. He was erasing us, slowly, methodically, the way you clear a field before you build something new on it. I went back to school with my father's photos in a paper grocery bag. The calls home grew harder to decode. My mother mentioned once, briefly, that Dennis had shouted at her over a credit card bill. Another time she called me at midnight, her voice strange and flat, and said she was sorry to bother me. It was nothing. She just hadn't been sleeping. I asked if she was safe. The pause before she said yes was 1 second too long. In March of my junior year, I sent her a card for no reason, just a watercolor bird I'd found in a shop near campus, with a note that said I was thinking of her. She texted me 2 weeks later. Loved the card. Dennis threw it away, but I kept the envelope. I stared at that text for a long time. By then, I'd been talking to Becca about it for months, piecing it together in fragments the way you do when you're trying to convince yourself it isn't as bad as it is. Becca had grown up with a father who operated the same way, and she had a clarity I lacked. "You're describing a man who controls everything she does," she said one night, cross-legged on her bed, looking at me steadily. "The photos, the phone calls, the money, the card. That's not a difficult man, Delaney. That's an abusive one." I knew she was right. I'd known for longer than I'd admitted. After graduation, I moved to Nashville for a reporting job at a regional outlet. A real job, with a salary and health insurance and a press badge that felt like proof of something. I found a 1-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city, furnished it slowly with secondhand pieces, learned to cook actual meals, called my mother on Sunday evenings, and pretended not to hear the distance in her voice. And then, on a Friday in February, she called me at 7 in the morning. Her voice was so quiet I had to press the phone against my ear. She said Dennis had hurt her. She said she'd fallen. That was the word she used, fallen, but she said it the wrong way, the way people say things they've been coached to say. She said it was fine. She said she didn't need anything. She said she just wanted to hear my voice. I called her back 4 times that day. She didn't answer. That night, I drove to Knoxville. She opened the door in a long-sleeved shirt in 60-degree weather. When I hugged her, she flinched on the left side. I asked her to show me her arm, and she shook her head, and I asked again. And finally, she rolled up her sleeve and showed me the bruise that ran from her elbow to her shoulder, deep green-yellow at the edges, the kind that comes from impact, not from falling. Dennis came home at 9. He walked in the door, saw me sitting at the kitchen table, and something passed across his face. Not quite surprise, not quite anger. Calculation. "Didn't know we were expecting company," he said. "She's not company," my mother said so quietly I almost missed it. He made a show of being pleasant all through dinner. He asked about my job, complimented the food, cleared the dishes. And then, when my mother went to the bathroom, he sat down across from me and put his hands flat on the table and said, without raising his voice at all, "I know why you're here, and I want you to understand something. Anything you think you know, you're wrong about. And anything you do from here is going to make things a lot harder for her, not easier. So think carefully." I drove back to Nashville that Sunday with my jaw clenched the whole way. I had pressed a folded piece of paper into my mother's hand before I left, the number for the Tennessee Domestic Violence Hotline, and the number for a family law attorney Becca had helped me find. My mother had looked at it and folded it smaller and smaller until it was the size of a thumbnail and tucked it into the pocket of her jeans. "Promise me you'll call them," I'd said. "I'll think about it," she said, which meant she wouldn't. The weeks after that had the texture of a held breath. I threw myself into work. I was covering a story about city council redistricting, a small, absorbing story with clean edges and facts I could verify. At night, I'd stare at the ceiling of my apartment and rehearse conversations I'd never have, arguments I couldn't make to someone who wasn't listening. Becca called twice a week. "You can't force her," she kept saying. I knew she was right. It didn't help. In April, I got a text from my mother's number that read, "I've been thinking. You were right." I want to leave, but I don't know how. I called her immediately. She picked up and her voice was low and rushed. Dennis was at a job site in Cookville, she said. She'd been thinking since my visit. She wanted to go, but she was afraid of what happened next, afraid of the finances, afraid he'd fight her over the house. I talked her through it slowly, step by step, the things I'd researched at 2 a.m. for 3 months. The hotline, the shelter network, the fact that Tennessee law gave her protections she didn't know she had. I told her I would help her through every single step. I told her I wasn't going anywhere. She said, okay, I think I'm ready. I drove back down that weekend and helped her put essentials into 2 suitcases. We moved quietly through the house she'd lived in for 20 years. Her house, paid for with my father's life insurance money, a fact Dennis had conveniently never acknowledged. She packed her important documents, her sewing scissors, the small framed photo of my father that she'd retrieved from the garage box, and kept in her nightstand drawer for 2 years without Dennis knowing. We were almost done when we heard the truck in the driveway. He came in the back door. He looked at the suitcases. He looked at my mother, and then he looked at me with an expression I will spend a long time trying to forget. What followed was not a conversation. He moved toward my mother first, his voice low and even, using the tone he'd always used. The tone that didn't rise, that didn't yell, that cut instead. I stepped between them and told him to stop. He turned to me. He grabbed my arm and twisted, and there was a pop and then a white, searing pain that radiated from my wrist up to my shoulder, and I went down onto the kitchen floor because my knees simply stopped working. He stood over me and said, "You have no idea who you're dealing with." My mother made a sound I'd never heard from her. Not quite a scream, something rawer than that. She moved. For the first time in years, she actually moved. She put herself between him and me and she said, Get out of my house." Her voice was shaking, but it was there, finally, fully. He laughed. He reached for her. And with my good hand, my right hand, I found my phone on the tile floor where it had landed and I did the only thing I could do. I opened my texts. I found Becca's name at the top. I couldn't type much. My hand was shaking too badly, so I typed the address of the house and 3 words. Call 911 now. Then I called out to my mother, the neighbors. Go to the neighbors, right now. She looked at me on the floor and something finally broke through whatever had been holding her in place. She ran. Dennis turned back to me and I looked him directly in the eyes. And I thought about my father, saying you face every wave head on, and I did not look away. Becca called 911 from Nashville. She also called my mother's next-door neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Teague who had lived on Sycamore Lane for 30 years and apparently did not hesitate for a single second when Becca told her what was happening. Mrs. Teague opened her door before my mother even reached the porch. She got my mother inside and locked the deadbolt. She called 911 herself. 2 officers arrived within 8 minutes. They found Dennis still in the kitchen. They found me still on the floor with a fractured wrist. They found my mother next door, wrapped in Mrs. Teague's cardigan, giving a statement in a voice that was shaking but coherent and full of things she had never said out loud before. He was arrested that night. Domestic assault, unlawful restraint, criminal threat. When they walked him past the kitchen window in handcuffs, I watched from the floor where a paramedic was wrapping my wrist, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not relief exactly. Just a vast, exhausted quiet, the kind that follows the end of a very long storm. My mother came to Nashville with me. She stayed in my apartment while her attorney filed the paperwork and the protective order was processed and the slow machinery of family law began to move. She slept in my bed and I slept on the couch, and in the mornings we drank coffee together by the window and talked, really talked, the way we hadn't since I was a child. She told me things about those years that I hadn't known, things she hadn't been able to say while she was inside them. She told me about the first time she had been afraid of him. She told me about the card I'd sent that he'd found in the mail before she did. She told me she'd read that phone number I'd pressed into her hand so many times that she had it memorized. I just couldn't make myself believe I was the kind of person that happens to, she said one morning, staring into her mug. I kept thinking, that's other people's lives, not mine. I know, I said. It is mine though, she said. It was mine. Dennis entered a guilty plea 4 months later. He was sentenced to 18 months, with a permanent protective order barring him from contact with my mother or me. My mother's attorney filed for divorce the same week. The house on Sycamore Lane, purchased with my father's insurance, titled in my mother's name, was not contested. She got it back. She sold it. She didn't want the walls anymore, she said. She wanted somewhere with different light. She's in Asheville now, in a small craftsman house she found on her own, with a backyard garden she planted herself this past spring. She got her sewing machine out of storage. The sound of it, when I visited 2 months ago, was the same as it always was. Steady, rhythmic, filling the house with motion. She looked up when I came in and smiled, a full, real smile. And I thought about that laugh I'd heard through the kitchen window 7 years earlier. The first time Dennis made her laugh, and I understood that what I was seeing now was something older and sturdier than that. Something that had survived the years between and come back in a different form. I started writing about what happened to us, not as a news story, as a first-person account filed with a national outlet that covers family and domestic policy. The response was bigger than I expected. A lot of people wrote in. A lot of people said, I thought it was just me. A lot of people said, I've been trying to find the words for something like this and you found them. I'm still answering those emails. I expect I will be for a while. Here's what I know now that I didn't know at 16. Abuse doesn't always announce itself. It learns your rhythms and works around them. It waits. It's patient in a way that love is supposed to be. It uses your own silence as a weapon, and it's very, very good at making the people inside it believe they are the problem. I was not the problem. My mother was not the problem. We were the people who finally, on a Tuesday evening in April, in a kitchen on Sycamore Lane, stopped letting him make us believe that we were. If you've spent time carrying someone else's weight and calling it love, I want you to know, there is a door. It may not open easily. It may take longer than you think you can hold out, but it opens. And on the other side of it, the world is the same size it always was, and you are still there in it, and the sewing machine still sounds the same, and the coffee is still warm, and the light is different, and it is better.